Alright, today I would like to talk to you about ancient Egyptian artifacts and monuments. Now, there's so many to choose from that I'm obviously going to have to be quite selective, so we'll stick with some of the most important and we'll go chronologically. The first artifact that we have of great importance is known as the Narmer Palette. And it's important because it appears to show the unification of the two major regions of ancient Egypt. Upper Egypt, which is actually in the south, and then Lower Egypt, which is in the north by the Nile Delta, where it fans out and reaches the Mediterranean Sea. So on the Narmer Palette, what we have is actually a representation of what might be the first pharaoh, Narmer, uniting the two regions for the first time, and therefore that's what makes him the first pharaoh and the beginning of the dynasties that will go all the way to the Ptolemaic period and up into the time of essentially the Romans, up to the Roman occupation. We don't know a lot about Narmer, but we can actually gain some information from this great artifact, the Narmer Palette. So if you look at this palette, what you actually have are two sides of a stone artifact that's about 25, a little over 25 inches in height, so it's over 2 feet tall, which is actually quite large, and both sides have been carved in sort of a low relief. And on both sides, you see the pharaoh represented repeatedly in different guises. On the back, in the central register, you have the pharaoh, and you can see him, and he is the largest image that you have. And the fact that he's the largest image says that he is the most important figure in this scene. So it's all about scale in Egyptian art. Whoever is being portrayed as the biggest, that's the most important figure. That's often going to be the pharaoh or some god or goddess. And then everybody else is going to be significantly smaller. So it's not like they're trying to display someone who's really short or something like that. It's only about importance, and that's what the scale has to do with in almost all of ancient Egyptian art, going back all the way to the beginning with the Narmer Palette. And you have the pharaoh holding a prisoner by the hair, and then you have the pharaoh with a mace or a club in his hand, and he's about to basically crush the skull of the defeated chieftain, we could say, from Lower Egypt, the region of the Nile Delta. And that's why also you can see in the sort of the central register, right by the head of the man who's about to get clubbed, you have a falcon, which is representing perhaps Horus, the god Horus, but also it's representing Narmer and his connection to Horus, or to some early falcon god, sky god. And the falcon is holding the prisoner sort of by the nose. And then there's 7 reeds, 6 or 7 reeds coming up out of behind the head of the guy who's about to get clubbed. And that might mean, it might be trying to show, look, there were actually 700 or 7,000 people killed at this particular battle. So there's a lot of symbolism going on in this. It's difficult to try and interpret if you're unfamiliar with ancient Egyptian art and principles. So the whole thing in general is basically honoring Narmer. And we have his name at the very top in the center. You can see a chisel and a catfish. So these early proto-hieroglyphs. And that's how we get Narmer. So that's how we get his name. It's actually in not a cartouche, but a surek, which is something that comes sort of earlier. It's a way of representing the pharaoh's name sort of inside a building, if you will, a royal residence, and you have his name inside that. And then below the pharaoh, you have sort of a line marking off a lower register, and then there's another group of two individuals being basically trampled symbolically, so they're under the feet of Narmer. So they're symbolically being trampled by the pharaoh. And there's also a couple basic hieroglyphs, which could represent either a name of a city, another city that he's destroyed, or it could be the name of whoever was the leader of that particular region that he conquered. So another bizarre thing, they're not exactly sure what it is. On both sides of the Narmer Palette, you can see this figure who's right next to the pharaoh. He's smaller, significantly smaller, but he's still quite large and therefore important. And he's holding the sandals of the pharaoh. So he's known as a sandal bearer. But what exactly his role was is unclear. Presumably he did more than just go around and hold somebody's shoes. So that's one of the sort of mysterious pieces of the Narmer Palette. Now, if you were to look at the other side of the Narmer Palette, there's a lot going on. So it's broken up once again into different registers. So you have sort of the top register, the middle, and then the lower register. So moving from the lowest one, you can actually see a bull crushing what looks like an enclosure wall. And that is the pharaoh in his role as sort of this mighty bull destroying another city. So it's another victory of his. And then as you move your way up to the middle register, you have a really strange set of images. You have two bizarre creatures that appear to be lions, but they're really not. They're sort of a mythical creature, and we actually find the same image in some Mesopotamian accounts. So it could be an example of some cultural diffusion of ideas. But what's being represented is likely order out of chaos, a common theme, or the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt once again. So there's different ways of reinforcing the same theme. Okay? Now in the top register, you have a lot of different people holding what looks to be like a staff, and then there's some image on the top of the staff. And these were sort of a processional group that would go before the pharaoh, either into battle, and it's a way of sort of bringing the power of certain gods into you and your army. At least that's one possibility of what it is. In fact, the ancient Egyptian hieroglyph for God, Neter, is sort of a pole with cloth wrapped around it, and then it looks like a flag almost at the end of it. So that's the sign you would use for God in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. So that's the Narmer Palette, and it is one of the first things, as I have up on the board here, 3100 BCE. So going way back. And the next major monument, in this case, to jump to would have to be, of course, the pyramids in general. We're not just going to touch on the pyramids at Giza. So I'm more concerned with having you understand that there's an evolution of pyramid building. So there wasn't just nothing and then perfect pyramids. There was a whole process that unfolded. And if you go way back to before even Narmer, so the pre-dynastic time in Egypt, you're going to have people buried in shallow pit graves, facing towards the west of the setting sun, so the land of the deceased. So there's always this idea of an afterlife of some kind, even going back into the pre-dynastic period in ancient Egypt. But eventually you're going to get something called mastabas, which are a room or a house. Imagine like a small one-story house. And that's really what it was. It was a place for the deceased individual to live. So they would have different rooms. Some of them even had evidence of what appears to be a bathroom, which is pretty interesting and strange, considering we're talking about deceased individuals. And then there would be areas to store grain and different goods. And then when you get after a mastaba, so moving forward, you're going to get to a point where now someone, Imhotep, to put a name to it, so is the architect of the 3rd dynasty pharaoh Djoser's pyramid. And this is the first pyramid that we actually have. And the idea was, why don't we take this mastaba and then place another one on top of it, and then another one that's even smaller on top of that. So you get this sort of stair-like step pyramid structure. And once you have that in place, and that, by the way, is in about 2630 BCE. In fact, I'll put that up here on the board. So, just to get some dates and some key facts for the pyramids. (2630 BCE), the 3rd dynasty, you're going to have that step pyramid. So, step pyramid. It's not a stretch to go from the idea of a step pyramid to realizing, well, hey, all we need to do is fill in sort of the gaps between the steps, and we can have this perfect structure. So a true pyramid. And that's what you get. However, there's a failure in the attempt. So the next sort of pharaoh that attempts this, Snefru, he actually fails. So he makes something called the bent pyramid. Okay? The bent pyramid is really important because it shows that the Egyptians, as smart as they were, obviously weren't experienced in making pyramids. So, what they had to do was learn from their mistakes. So when they built this bent pyramid, it was not on, there wasn't enough bedrock beneath it, and as the weight gets piled on, it starts to shift and sink almost. So as they're building it up towards a perfect pyramid, all of a sudden it had to angle sharply in and finish because there was just too much weight. And after you have the bent pyramid, they realize just how much weight's involved in this, and they get better at making it. And so you get the red pyramid, then you're going to get finally the pyramid complex at the Giza plateau.